The disciples of New Haven is under attack.
A city is getting attacked by alien-looking creatures. We equip our response team, use our shuttle to bring them to the place of action, land, fight, and hopefully defeat the attackers in turn-based combat. Their corpses and some captured creatures are being sent to our laboratories, where they are awaited by our scientists who are eager to do their autopsies and biopsies, with the hope that any findings will help in our future missions. Sounds like XCOM, but actually, it's Phoenix Point. Well, at least today. The parallels aren't minor and random though, and so before we will actually move to the review itself, we should have a look at the development history of the XCOM series. The XCOM series and their creator, Julian Gollop. Are you excited yet? Well then, let's dive into it. The XCOM series was born in 1994 with the release of UFO Enemy Unknown, borrowing its alien setting from the British TV show of the same name back then, which also led to the game getting renamed in the US to XCOM UFO Defense in order to avoid any future legal issues. But XCOM hasn't been Gollop's first game in that direction. The series has been preceded by a couple of other titles like Laser Squad, which had been released in 1988 and in which you could already find the turn-based tactical combat with action points. XCOM Apocalypse from 97 had been the third part of the series and the second XCOM game Gollop worked on, who then started designing his next title called The Dreamland Chronicles Freedom Ridge in 2001, which was supposed to be a reboot of the series with a different name, as the license had always been owned by the publisher Microprose and not by Gollop himself. While the game had been cancelled during development, it's interesting nevertheless out of two reasons. First one being that this had been the cornerstone for XCOM successors without the license, as other developers picked up the cancelled game, continued to develop it and released it as UFO Aftermath, which then had its own successors. The second reason why it's interesting is because of its feature lists, but we will come back to that in a second. As mentioned, the XCOM license was owned by Microprose and has been further reused without Gollop's involvement, with less praiseworthy games like XCOM Interceptor and XCOM Enforcer. Microprose had been bought by Hasbro, and in the end, the XCOM license had been sold to Take-Two Interactive, which again owns Firaxis, the company which rebooted the license in 2012. Again, without Julian Gollop and with significant changes to the gameplay. The action point system had been removed and replaced by a 2-action system. The hit and aim system had been extremely simplified, and that led to a whole bunch of other connected mechanics which had to be adjusted as well, which tainted the whole game concept so much for me personally that I didn't find it enjoyable anymore. But without doubt, Firaxis had been extremely successful with the game. And with that, they gave the whole genre a second wind and also showed how a modern form of these games could look like on a visual level. And who knows whether without Firaxis XCOM, Gollop would even have done his next step. 2017, he presented his latest project called Phoenix Point on the crowdfunding platform Feek. Back then, he was actually intending to have a 2-action system similar to Firaxis had in the new XCOM games. One of the reasons why I lost interest right away and didn't keep following it. Either way, the funding on Feek had been successful and he gathered $765,000, a fair bit more than the requested $500,000. A lot of money, but also not an insane amount for a big project. But Gollop, who is British, already moved over to Bulgaria, where his new team and studio Snapshot Games is located, and that way he at least was able to reduce the production costs by just living in a less expensive country. Nevertheless, an offer by Epic apparently had been too good to be refused, which is why the game first released in December 2019 as Epic exclusive for 1 year, with some disdain by some fans and backers of the project on Feek. So in December 2020, the 1 year of exclusivity ended and the game has been finally released on GOG and Steam in a version called Year 1 Edition, which already includes the 3 DLCs which had been released in the meanwhile. And as I also heard of them dropping the 2-action system and going back to a classic action point system, my interest was reawakened as well. Therefore, I got myself this Year 1 edition, and after about 200 hours of game time and several patches later, I finally finished the game. And with that, we are getting to the game, starting with somewhat of a small caveat. Together with these patches, there also had been releases of additional DLCs. And while these patches are mostly integrated into ongoing playthroughs, DLCs require that you activate them at the start of a playthrough, meaning that you would need to completely restart from scratch. Which kind of makes sense as they're also introducing new features with some impact on the whole game. For example, one of the DLCs introduces air combat and another introduces a new class to the game. That said, this shouldn't have any significant impact on anything I'm going to say in this review, including game mechanics, praise and criticism. So, as mentioned, when starting the game, we are going to decide which DLCs we want to activate for our playthrough. In addition, we can also select the difficulty level, which impacts not only the amount of enemies and their attacks, but also influences how strong our own soldiers are. Additional options like an Iron Man mode are not available. Actually, you can save at absolutely every point in the game, even within combat, which I'd consider as problematic. But we'll get back to that later. You can choose whether you want to skip the prologue and the tutorial, but I recommend to keep that active for the first time. The tutorial will of course explain some of the game mechanics, mostly concerning the tactical combat, which I will explain later on, but this prologue also introduces us further into the setting of the game, and that is actually a little bit different to what we know from XCOM. In Phoenix Point, we don't fight against aliens which are paying us a visit with their UFOs, but against creatures which are coming out of the oceans and which seem to have their origin in some kind of plague or strange mutation which merges different genes together. As a result, these creatures aren't that different to aliens from space, but if you picture yourself some slimy horror creatures from the depths of the ocean, you wouldn't be far off either, without them being straight crab people like in XCOM Terror from the Deep. And while in the original XCOM we have to defend humans against an alien invasion, humans are already almost extinct in Phoenix Point.
Thousands of people! Thousands!
The mist is gone, but the city is dead. The roads are broken. You must join one of the havens. Do not attempt to survive on your own.
This is, by the way, another parallel to the cancelled Dreamland Chronicles, which, as mentioned before, had been completed as UFO Aftermath by a different team. This game also had a setting where aliens from the oceans already killed off almost all humans on the planet. In Phoenix Point, the survivors are mostly organized in 3 different factions. You got the Disciples of Anu, which kind of see the creatures and mutations as gods and even expose themselves to mutations voluntarily. The faction on the opposite end is called New Jericho. They are promoting the pureness of human DNA and instead focus on technical advancements to exterminate all mutations. And lastly, there is Synedrion, a faction which somewhat stands in between the other both, but which follows a very utopian and pacifistic path, which is making them into the sleepyheads who are losing themselves in debates while the world is burning.
But the Pandora virus had little interest in their arguments, and its power was still growing.
As Phoenix Project, we are, similar as in the other games, an autonomous organization, and while these factions aren't directly financing us, in fact there's no money at all in the game and just resources, it is still important to assist one or multiple of these factions. One good reason for that is that the game is actually lost if the majority of remaining humans bites the dust, but another one is that a good reputation with these factions actually grants some bonuses, especially in the field of research. During the course of the game, which has a very sandboxy structure where we can decide for ourselves when we want to do which mission, the story is advancing once we come across certain triggers. For example, the factions will contact us once we research the technology, which brings up some ethically questionable options. The factions will then ask us for our decisions or even have specific missions for us. We will also encounter some splinter groups, which will approach us with their own requests and missions as well. Overall, this happens relatively often, and there has been quite a bit of effort put into this. Lots of the texts are actually coming with voiceovers, and there are also several cutscenes. And while they have been made relatively simplistic with animated pictures, they don't come across as cheap and definitely enrich the game and offer some diversity, giving the player new goals and motivations which go beyond doing generic battles and improving your soldiers and bases. All this management of our organization, the Phoenix Project, is being done and supervised from the Geoscape, a map view of the whole world, which you might already know from the first XComs of the 90s. On the top border of the screen we can see several important values. Starting from left, we first find our main resources, tech, material and foods, and among other things they are being used for building bases and equipment and also for recruiting new soldiers. In the middle of the top bar we see our total capacities, and on the right we see a Doomsday clock, a display for showing us how much time we got left until the end of the world, the extinction of humanity. Not measured in time though, but in remaining population. And if this population goes below a certain level, the game is lost. On the highest difficulty, at least 20% of the population must survive, and on the lowest difficulty it's 5%. But there's no reason for panic, and there's not a huge time pressure either. While especially at the beginning the population is going to shrink by itself, as settlements often start out with more population than they can sustain, the main factor for loss of population are attacks on the settlements, either by aliens or by other factions later on. And while in the beginning there are some unavoidable losses, as you will start somewhere locally on the planet and just can't reach all cities in time, this shouldn't happen anymore later on. Let me remind you that there is no Iron Man mode in the game. If you let a settlement fall, then that's usually your decision that you don't want to bother with it. Especially as this Doomsday clock is global and basically real-time, and you are not financed by the population, I'd consider Phoenix Point as much more plannable than other XCOM titles, where you got lots of different nations on the planet, which will actually cut your payment if you don't help them. And that payment happens at the end of each month, meaning you got to hope that at the end of the month the money will be enough to pay for your ongoing endeavors. So again, no panic regarding the countdown. If you really lose because of that, then you were probably provoking it. Below this top interface bar, we'll find a list of active missions and ongoing attacks on the left and ongoing constructions and researches on the right side. Though only the next 10 projects which will be finished are actually visible, as the rest is unfortunately going out of the screen and is therefore hidden. In the middle of the right side, we'll find the controls of the time, which we can use to accelerate time, slow it down or completely pause it. In addition, we can also find a log here. And just on top of the bottom interface bar, we also got a display of our selected aircraft and its crew. And with that, we are getting to one of my main points of criticism. There's a serious lack of user-friendliness in some elements of the Geoscape and its submenus, to which we'll get in a minute. The display for the airplanes works well if you just have a handful of them, but later in the game you will have like 10 or more, and usually a team consists of 2 airplanes to bring the maximum of 8 people to the destination as quickly as possible. And switching through the airplanes each time just to find the 2 correct ones is just unnecessarily cumbersome. You can't rename your aircrafts, you don't have a good overview where you can decently see these pairs of crafts, and you also can't reorder the crafts so that you have the right ones next to each other. Aircrafts which are just idling around somewhere can't be properly identified either, meaning that at the start of each gaming session it's a good idea to just switch through all crafts to make sure nobody is just hanging around. Let's get to the buttons at the bottom edge of the screen. The first one is for the Geoscape, which we just looked at, so we can jump right to the second button, Bases, which, as you might have guessed already, is for planning our bases and which rooms we got in each one. There aren't really any complex mechanics though. You don't have any symbiosis of rooms or anything similar. The only thing you should know is that healing and training effects of the according rooms are accumulative, but only for the local base. So the bases you want to use as quarters for your soldiers should have multiple of these buildings, while they can be removed in all the other bases. Speaking of other bases, while we receive our initial base within the tutorial, we can already see the locations of the other bases on the world map. These can then be unlocked later in the game using our resources, tech, material and food. As you might expect, the third button for personnel shows our personnel, but you probably don't expect to also find the creatures here which we captured in the missions, and which are not just being used for research, but which can also be turned into resources, which is neatly called as harvesting in the game. Regarding our own soldiers, we are going to be overwhelmed with a horribly cumbersome list depending on the progress of our playthrough. It's working fine with just 1 or 2 teams, but with 3 or more and additional individual soldiers and vehicles which are just either parked somewhere or jetting through the world, you will easily lose any overview. It's also not helping that a single team is usually split up between 2 different aircrafts, which are showing up at different parts of the list. So what I did early in the game was to go through all my soldiers to rename them in a way that indicates which team they are actually belonging to. This screen is also being used for transferring the soldiers on an airplane, assuming one is currently located at the same base. I'd also like to quickly mention at this point that each soldier got endurance, which you can see displayed beneath the soldier's hit point bar. Each character can only do a limited amount of missions in the fields before the endurance left is getting so low that as a penalty the action points available are getting reduced. And of course that should be avoided by letting the characters rest now and then by returning them to a base for a while. And remember, the building effects stack. Just don't think too much about why a soldier regenerates more quickly if there are more beds to sleep in. A small icon next to the characters will also show you that they are currently not wielding any weapon, which we can't change from this screen directly. For that we need to switch to the equipment window. But before we do that, let's have a look to the right side of the screen, where we can also see the willpower points of the selected character. Similar to mana in fantasy games, these determine how often we can do special attacks and actions on that character. An extremely important value not shown in the equipment screen, which is where the according attribute can be increased. And while we are at increasing the character's attributes, each character got 3 attributes, which can be increased using skill points, strength, willpower and speed. And the higher the attribute is, the higher the costs will be to increase it further. These skill points can also be used in order to learn active and passive abilities, which are then dependent on the class of the character. Especially interesting in this context is that these skill points are being collected by each character in parallel to the experience points. At the same time, you also have a global pool of Phoenix skill points, which you can freely distribute on any of your characters needing them. So if the character skill points are not enough to learn an ability, these global Phoenix skill points can help out. But experience points aren't obsolete either. To the opposite, the actions you can learn on each character are limited by the character's experience level. Only after reaching level 7, all skills of the class are unlocked and can be learned using skill points. Regarding classes, there's quite a selection as well, including assaults with their machine guns, heavies with the really heavy weapons, snipers with sniper rifles, but also priests, which can apply buffs and can mind control enemies. Technicians, who can place turrets, and infiltrators, who can send out spider drones. And in addition to that, you can also combine classes. At level 4, you get the option to unlock the skills of a second class, so that you could have a priest who can now also use sniper rifles, and who can also learn the special sniper actions. Lastly, you also get additional options to modify your soldiers via implants and mutations, which had been added to the game with the DLC already included in the Year 1 edition. This all makes the character system a bit confusing and quite hard to grasp at the beginning, but I think mechanically it's actually well made, as it offers you lots of options to improve and develop your characters, and several of these options actually make a real difference in combat, which we will get to in a few minutes. The interface, on the other hand, not made that well. I already mentioned that we can't actually see the willpower here, but perception and the whole stealth mechanic, as well as several stats on the weapons, aren't explained at all. But on top of that, there's one other issue. If you intend to rescue as many settlements as possible, then it is unavoidable to also have multiple teams spread over the whole world, which you can then quickly send to their mission locations. And while humans actually need airplanes to get to the locations, they seem to be a bit further regarding items, as these are available anywhere. The pro of that is that you don't need to craft equipment for every single team and individual character, which is then carried around all the time. The con, however, is that as the manager of the whole operation, it's our job to take care of equipping and unequipping all the stuff. And as you can already guess, the interface isn't exactly making our lives easier with that either. There are no templates, and so you will spend about 10 minutes before each mission just unequipping and re-equipping items. So you are actively punished for playing efficiently. And that's something which definitely could and should have been done more elegantly. By the way, there's also a small bug when filling up ammo. Sometimes the refill button just refuses to work, but, well, considering the game is almost bug-free otherwise, I can live with that. Let's jump over to the next screen, the research window. Similar as in other XCOM-like games, we can initiate research projects here in order to get access to new buildings and passive bonuses, but also new classes and of course new equipment, which we will definitely need later on to cope with some of the tougher aliens. The total amount of researchable equipment isn't huge though, and there are also no massive jumps, which kind of also diffuses the potential issue to accidentally research into the wrong directions for too long, like it could happen in the old XCOM titles. And like in the old titles, you cannot see the full research tree in Phoenix Point either, probably to bring a bit more tension into the situation. Of course, you could just look it up externally, but because of the diffused situation, you really don't need to. In the bottom right corner, you can also see the research shared by your allies. With the appropriate reputation, you don't just get new research projects to which you wouldn't have access otherwise, but you also profit from your allies' research points. Once we researched some cool new stuff, we should have a look into the next section, the production screen. Here we can put new equipment we researched as well as vehicles and aircrafts into production. The general overview has the qualities we are used to by now, and when you scrap items, the interface can also go completely crazy. But besides of that, there isn't anything noteworthy. The diplomacy screen shows us the three factions I mentioned in the beginning, their reputation towards us and also to each other. If we manage to increase the reputation for the individual factions, they will ask us to do missions for them to prove our loyalty towards them, and then share technologies with us, which is quite helpful. It's less helpful that they can't really stand each other, and at some point they might even attack each other and also reduce the total population that way. Lastly, we also got a button for the Phoenixpedia. Like in the old XCOM games or the Civlopedia from a certain other game from Microprose, this can be used to look up specific units, items and also game mechanics. So we are finished with the interface options, but before we jump into the combat, we'll have a quick look on what we can actually do on the world map. We got our bases and our airplanes, which can be sent to any nodes in their distance. As we hardly discovered anything at the start of the game, our range will also be very reduced at that point. We are heading to these nodes shown as question marks with our planes and explore what is hiding there. Oftentimes it's a settlement of one of the three factions, and there we can do a couple of things. We can recruit new soldiers, attack and try to steal one of their aircrafts, but we can also just trade with them. Especially the last thing can give us a significant boost in materials, but unfortunately this is also as boring as it gets, and again, it's lacking a good overview. Similar like equipping and unequipping items, an efficient playstyle isn't exactly the most exciting one here. But besides of settlements, you can also find lots of different events in these nodes. In these cases, you will get a description of the situation and often you have to make a decision, which will determine any reputation gains and losses and resources you will get. Really big decisions, which would lead to a loss of a character or would have major diplomatic consequences, don't exist there though. Still, the events are often interestingly written and bring some nice diversification. But we can also find resource gathering missions and missions where we got to rescue someone. These don't have to be done right away though, and you could return to them if your teams have nothing else to do in the area. And then of course you also got the story missions, which are clearly shown with the proper location labels. You should definitely give the highest priority to settlements which are getting attacked, and once you rescued that settlement, there's also a chance that you will find the alien nest which caused the attack, which should then be your next target for extermination. And with that, we will have a look at the tactical combat. Our team is always starting together at the edge of the mission map, so they are not landing somewhere in the middle of the map and instantly get shot upon leaving the shuttle like it could happen in the older XCOM. Our objective is displayed on the top left, and most of the time it will be to kill all the aliens, though there can also be different objectives. For example, in order to steal the airplane from a faction, we need to run to the plane and then survive together with the plane for 5 turns. When attacking an alien nest, we have to locate and eliminate the broodmother. The first thing we should do is to just look at the premises. Now, where's our target and how do we get there best? And if we don't need to kill everyone, it's also important to check where the new enemies will enter the map and where we need to go with our team to evacuate it. Next we are going to advance and move with our characters using the 4 action points everyone has. But don't be fooled, this isn't a simplified system like in Phyrexis XCOM where you only had 2 actions per turn. In Phoenix Point you can actually do a movement with just a fraction of an action point. So a heavy could do a very short movement first, then use 3 action points to shoot and then still use the rest of the first action point to move again. If we move a character and within that movement a new enemy is being discovered, then the character will not just continue his path like an idiot, but he will actually stop and wait for new commands, having only used up that fraction of the action points which he or she actually used for that partial movement. As mentioned before, every class has a range of own abilities, and some of these are active and can be used by spending willpower points. Heavies can actually use their jetpack armor to jump over huge distances or even onto roofs. Snipers get the ability early on to reduce shooting costs by 1 action point. While that reduces the attack costs of a normal sniper rifle from 3 to 2 points, the costs of attacking with a tranquilizer are reduced from 1 to 0 points, meaning you can shoot as often as you want until either the willpower runs out or the gun runs out of ammo and needs to be reloaded. By the way, tranquilizers do reduce the enemy's action points, and in the most extreme case, the enemy gets completely stunned and can be taken back to base as prisoner. One thing I already liked in the XCOM and also Jagged Alliance games from the 90s, but which couldn't be found in all of the games, is the Destructible Environment. While this can make a relevant difference occasionally, especially if you got vehicles or enemies which can just drive or run through walls, you will usually just destroy some cover here and there, and it's not deciding the course of a battle. Unlike in Xenonauts, for example, where I accidentally had a cave-in of a building which hadn't been too healthy for my crew inside of it. In most cases you will just see how some missing shots destroy the environment by accident. And I think that's actually the coolest aspect of the combat. Well, not destroying the environment, but that you got a realistic ballistic calculation. While in the new XCOM titles, the only things relevant for the hit chance are the distance of the enemy and whether the enemy got an object next to him so that it's counting as being in cover, in Phoenix Point every projectile gets a realistic calculation. So if from the soldier's perspective you can only see the left arm of the enemy, then this is also the only part he or she can hit. And you can even jump into this perspective so that you can manually aim and estimate the hit chances. If you aim manually, you can see 2 different circles with a different radius around the center of the screen. The inner circle represents the first 50% hit chance, and the outer circle the other 50%. So if the enemy is filling out both circles, you got a hit chance of 100%. If you aim for the head, however, and this head only fills out the inner circle and the outer one only covers a bit of the torso, then you have a hit chance of maybe 70% to hit the enemy with a decent chance of hitting the head. I can see how you could criticize in this context that manual aiming is so important that you basically need to do it every single time to not put yourself to a disadvantage, but I personally don't see this as a big problem, as it smoothly integrates into the flow after using it a couple of times. There's one thing where Phoenix Point did go for a more modern approach though. While the old XCOM games used reaction shots, these have been replaced in Phoenix Point with the now more commonly used Overwatch mechanic. If the character still got action points left for an attack, or as sniper 1 point less thanks to a sniper ability, then you can tell the character to look into a direction in a specific angle, and as soon as an enemy runs into that cone, then the soldier will attack once. By the way, this is also true if the enemy just leans around a corner to shoot, which is possible if you are behind a wall counting as high cover. Speaking of enemies. Of course we will fight against mutants from the seas most of the time, which come in very different shapes. There are some creatures which learned how to use sniper rifles and some which got shields where you should try to aim for the arm holding that shield. There are creatures which are catapulting little worms all over the map, sirens with hands like scissors, and small critters which try to jump into our soldiers' faces to take them over. And the variety is even expanded quite a bit by also having the creatures mutating, adapting to our soldiers, develop better armor and so on, though the effects of these enemy developments aren't really that huge. Besides of the mutant aliens, we will also fight against different human factions. A robot faction and some monsters from Ruins which were added with a DLC, and you could consider as some kind of robots as well. Against this last faction, you do have more battles than was healthy to the game, but in total there's definitely enough variety in the enemies you face. A bit more variety would have been nice in regards to graphics for locations though. While there are a couple of different settings, from city-like maps over post-apocalyptic ruins, antique ruins and of course alien hives, I am missing some more landscape types, like snow surroundings when you are fighting in the Antarctic, or desert landscapes when you are in the north of Africa, or well, just fields with crops. I think in that regard the old titles and also Xenonauts got a bit more to offer. Maybe these settings were just not gloomy enough to fit into the game. I mean, they clearly do try to create a very dark and threatening environment, which reminded me of Terror from the Deep, which is also supported by the music, which was contributed by James Broomhall, who already did the music for the first 4 XCOM titles of the 90s. While there isn't any major problem on the level of tactical combat, there are a couple of things which keep it from being perfect. One thing which kinda stands out is one specific weapon where the balancing is quite off, so that it gets a bit silly. And while the interface in combat is better than in the Geoscape view, there are quite a few explanations missing regarding how some mechanics actually work. Like what I just explained about aiming, how Overwatch is triggered exactly, and also how stealth is working. And lastly, I also consider it as a bad decision to just let the player save freely at any point, as saving and loading can kill off any tactical aspects. For example, you could first look around where the enemies are and then reload to get into the perfect positions. Or you could just reload each time you got hit by an enemy, so that you don't need to care about cover and similar things anymore anyways. You can also restart the map from scratch, which is an option which actually makes no sense if you can save freely. So what I did personally is to just enforce a house rule on myself, so that I'm not allowed to save during combat to not ruin the tactical challenge. And if anything went terribly wrong, I just restarted the whole map and tried to do better on the next try. But it's actually kinda silly that when restarting the map, all the enemies are completely re-rolled as well, which can make a restarted map significantly easier or harder than before. Not really great for players looking for a challenge, as you kinda need to enforce this challenge on yourself by your own discipline. Because, as mentioned, there is no option to disable free saving, as you can find it in Jagged Alliance 2 for example. None of these points completely spoils the combat, and some of them you can avoid by house rules, but I think that the otherwise extremely well executed aspect of tactical combat gets a couple of ugly scratches by these issues. Time to draw a conclusion. In my eyes, Phoenix Point is the more coherent successor to the XCOM series than what Firaxis released about 10 years ago with XCOM Enemy Unknown. Julian Gollop, who already designed the original game, keeps all the core elements of these games and gives them a new face, modernizes and expands them in some places where it actually makes sense. Especially the function of switching into the first-person perspective and being able to see how exactly the soldier can hit the enemy is something I already wished to have in these games like 20 years ago, and first saw in an early version of Spy DNA. I also liked the cutscenes, which occurred more often than I expected, and the gloomy atmosphere, also thanks to the original composer John Broomhall. But the game also has a couple of things which could still be improved on, like a lack of explanations of a couple of important mechanics, which you need to check externally. The interface is also a weak point of the game, especially when equipping and unequipping your characters. This and also the trading in Geoscape are two mechanics where efficient gameplay is just not fun, and which the developers probably didn't think through. Luckily, this doesn't overshadow the rest of the game, which is also why I would recommend it to everyone who likes tactics games, and especially to those players who weren't really convinced by Firaxis' interpretation. As mentioned in the beginning, I played the Year 1 edition with the most up-to-date patches. The DLC's expansions, which were released since then, added a couple of new features like air combat, and they expanded the game in the breadth. You can get the DLCs for quite cheap, but it's important to keep in mind that you won't be able to activate any additional DLC which you might not have bought yet into an active game. Also, you won't be able to deactivate any DLC retroactively if you don't like individual elements like the air combat. And that's all about Phoenix Points. I hope that this extensive look into the game gave you a good overview. I'd also welcome if you wrote about your opinion of the game and your experiences with the XCOM series into the comments. A full Let's Play of the game can be found on my German Let's Play channel, and I will probably also cover Xenonauts 2 in the future, so feel free to subscribe if you don't want to miss that. If you're interested in which other games I played during my 39 years, you can have a look at ndnw.net. Just be aware that most of the linked videos will be German. And with that, it's time to say goodbye for now. After I rescued this world, I hope to find some more sane friends in the next one. Until next time, bye bye.
You have the firepower. The power! Hailstorms of fire and acid. Raid the lab and share the tech with us. All this time in hiding has left us damaged and in need of urgent repairs. If you succeed, we will both gain. Humanity will gain. We are the pure. The pure? We are the future. Help us, Phoenix. Help our species.